Philosophy doesn't create heroes, but sometimes heroes create philosophy. In the case of Leonidas, one man's actions became the blueprint for an entire school of thought. When action speaks louder than words. Picture this. Centuries before Zeno would establish the Stoic school in Athens, before Marcus Aurelius would pen his Meditations, before Epictetus would teach about inner freedom, there lived a king who already embodied every principle these philosophers would later articulate. His name was Leonidas of Sparta, and he didn't just practice Stoicism. He lived it so completely that scholars argue he inspired the very foundation of the philosophy itself. This isn't just another war story. This is about a man who proved that true strength isn't measured in victories, but in how you face inevitable defeat. It's about leadership that transforms through example rather than commands. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't roar. It simply stands firm when everything else falls apart. If you're tired of motivational speakers who've never been tested, if you're looking for real wisdom forged in actual fire, then this is your story. Because Leonidas didn't write books about mental toughness, he became the living definition of it. He didn't theorize about controlling what you can control. He demonstrated it with every breath, right up to his last. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and make sure to subscribe for more content like this. And hey, don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of wisdom and warrior spirit. Now let's dive in. The forge of character, where iron will was born. To understand the man who would face impossible odds without flinching, we need to understand where that unbreakable spirit was forged. The Agog wasn't just Sparta's educational system. It was a machine designed to strip away everything soft, everything weak, everything that couldn't withstand pressure. And young Leonidas wasn't just a student. He became its masterpiece. Imagine being 7 years old and having everything comfortable ripped away. No warm bed, no mother's embrace, no gentle encouragement. Instead, hunger as a teaching tool, pain as a curriculum, and shame as the price for weakness. Boys who entered the Agog weren't coddled. They were hammered like metal on an anvil until only the strongest core remained. But here's what made Leonidas different. While other children broke or hardened into cruel shells, he transformed. The deprivation didn't embitter him, it clarified him. The physical pain didn't make him violent, it made him controlled. The psychological pressure didn't crush his spirit, it compressed it into something diamond hard. Every morning before dawn, while soft boys in other cities slept in warm beds, Leonidas was already moving, running until his lungs burned, training until his muscles screamed, learning to find calm in the center of chaos. The Agogs taught him that comfort is the enemy of greatness, that luxury breeds weakness, and that true strength comes from accepting hardship as a friend rather than fighting it as an enemy. This wasn't just physical conditioning, it was spiritual alchemy. Each painful lesson etched itself into his character. Every moment of endurance became a building block of the iron will that would one day stare down the Persian Empire. The boy who learned to sleep on stone would become the man who could rest easy knowing death was coming. Other children learned to read and write. Leonidas learned something more valuable. He learned to read himself, to understand his own fears and master them, to recognize his own impulses and control them, to see his own weaknesses and strengthen them. By the time he emerged from the Agog, he wasn't just a warrior, he was a philosopher in armor, though he'd never call himself that. The system that broke lesser men refined Leonidas into something unprecedented, a leader who commanded not through fear, but through respect earned in shared suffering. A king who would never ask his men to endure what he hadn't already endured himself. A human being who had looked into the abyss of his own limitations and walked away stronger. Years later, when Persian messengers would threaten him with annihilation, they were speaking to a man who had been annihilated and rebuilt every day for years. When they promised him suffering, they were addressing someone who had made suffering his teacher. When they offered him the choice between submission and death, they were talking to a person who had already chosen his path long before they arrived. The Agoge didn't just prepare Leonidas for war, it prepared him for life. It taught him that every day is a choice between who you were and who you could become. That strength isn't the absence of struggle, but the transformation of struggle into purpose. That leadership isn't about being above others, but about being willing to go first into whatever darkness awaits. The weight of a crown, leadership through sacrifice. Most men spend their lives trying to gain power. Leonidas spent his learning to wield it responsibly. When he ascended to the Spartan throne, he didn't inherit just a title. He inherited a sacred trust. The trust of a people who had built their entire civilization on the belief that some things are worth dying for, and that those who lead must be the first to prove it. Sparta wasn't ruled by politicians making promises they'd never have to keep. It was led by warrior kings who understood that true authority comes from being willing to pay the highest price for the decisions you make. Leonidas embodied this principle so completely that his reign became a masterclass in leadership through sacrifice. While other rulers hoarded wealth and comfort, Leonidas shared the hardships of his people. He ate the same black broth as his soldiers, slept under the same stars, bled the same blood in training. He didn't rule from a palace, he led from the front lines of life itself. This wasn't political theater, it was philosophical practice. The daily choice to serve rather than be served, to give rather than take, to strengthen others rather than diminish them. But leadership, as Leonidas understood it, wasn't about being loved. It was about being trusted to make the right choice when everything was on the line. And that choice came when Persian scouts brought news that would change everything. Xerxes was coming. The god-king of the largest empire in history was marching west with a force so massive it was said to drink rivers dry. Lesser kings might have calculated odds, sought alliances, looked for ways to negotiate or escape. Leonidas did something different. He looked inward, not to his fears, but to his principles. Not to what he might lose, but to what he couldn't afford to lose. The freedom of his people, the honor of his ancestors, the responsibility he had accepted when he took the crown. This is where Leonidas proved that true leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having unshakable principles when the questions become impossible. He couldn't guarantee victory against Xerxes. He couldn't promise his men would return home. But he could promise them something more valuable, that their sacrifice would matter, that their stand would echo through history, that choosing to resist impossible odds was better than choosing to live on your knees. The decision to march to Thermopylae wasn't made in anger or desperation. It was made with the cold clarity of a man who understood that some moments define not just your life, but the meaning of life itself. Leonidas looked at the approaching storm and saw not just an enemy army, but a test of everything Sparta claimed to believe, everything he had been trained to embody, everything his crown represented. When he selected his 300 companions for what he knew would be a one-way journey, he didn't choose the strongest or the fastest. He chose men with sons, men who had something to live for, but were willing to die for something greater. Men who understood, as he did, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. This was leadership at its purest, not commanding others to take risks you won't take, but going first into the darkness and trusting that your example will light the way for others to follow. Leonidas didn't order his men to be brave. He showed them what bravery looked like, and they couldn't help but rise to meet his standard. The art of the impossible, strategic brilliance at Thermopylae. Most people remember Thermopylae as a glorious last stand. 300 Spartans against impossible odds, fighting to the death in a narrow mountain pass. But that's only part of the story. The real genius of Leonidas wasn't in how he died, but in how he chose to die. Every decision he made was calculated not for immediate victory, but for maximum impact on the future. Leonidas was no fool charging blindly into battle. He was a strategist who understood that sometimes losing a battle is the only way to win a war. When he surveyed the geography of Thermopylae, the narrow pass between mountain and sea, he saw something his enemies couldn't. A place where numbers meant nothing, where discipline meant everything, and where a small force could hold back an empire long enough to wake up the world. The hot gates weren't chosen randomly. They were chosen because they turned the Persian advantage into a disadvantage. In that narrow space, Xerxes couldn't use his cavalry. He couldn't bring his full numbers to bear. He couldn't use intimidation or spectacle. He could only send his men forward, a few at a time, to face warriors who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of fight. But Leonidas understood something even deeper. This wasn't really about military tactics. It was about psychological warfare on a scale no one had ever attempted. Every hour his 300 held, the pass was an hour that proved the mighty Persian Empire could be resisted. Every Persian who fell showed that Xerxes wasn't truly a god. Every moment of defiance sent a message that would spread across the Greek world. It's possible to say no to tyrants. The beauty of the Spartan defense lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. Form ranks, hold the line, fight with discipline rather than rage. Trust your training, trust your brothers, trust the principle that free men fighting for their homeland will always have advantages that slaves fighting for conquest can never match. When Persian arrows darkened the sky, Leonidas the Spartan allegedly said, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." This wasn't bravado. It was the voice of men who had made peace with death and found freedom in that acceptance. They weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove that survival isn't the highest value, that honor matters more than breathing, that some defeats are worth more than easy victories. Leonidas orchestrated all of this with the calm precision of a conductor leading a symphony. He didn't micromanage his warriors. He trusted their training and focused on what only he could provide, an example of unshakable resolve. When his men saw their king standing firm in the storm of bronze and blood, never retreating a step, never showing doubt, they found strength they didn't know they possessed. For 3 days, the impossible held. 300 men, plus their Greek allies, contained an army of hundreds of thousands. They turned one of history's most powerful military forces into a traffic jam of frustrated soldiers who couldn't understand why these stubborn Greeks wouldn't just die quietly. But Leonidas knew it couldn't last forever. He knew about the mountain path that would allow the Persians to attack from behind. He knew that Ephialtes, or someone like him, would eventually betray the Greek position. The question wasn't whether they would be surrounded. It was how they would respond when they were. And when that moment came, when the trap closed around them, Leonidas made his final strategic decision. He sent away the allies who could still escape. He kept only those who chose to stay. And he prepared to transform a military defeat into a moral victory that would outlast empires. The eternal echo, how death became immortality. What do you call a king who loses his kingdom, a general who loses his army, a warrior who loses his life? If you're talking about Leonidas, you call him victorious, because he achieved something rarer than military conquest. He achieved immortality through meaning. His death at Thermopylae didn't end his influence. It amplified it beyond anything he could have accomplished by surviving. The final day at Thermopylae wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Leonidas and his remaining Spartans knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't dying in vain, they were dying on purpose. Every sword stroke was a word in a message that would echo through history. Resistance is possible, tyranny can be challenged, and free people will fight for freedom even when fighting means dying. When the arrows finally found their mark and Leonidas fell, something incredible happened. Instead of ending, his story began. The Persian Empire had won the battle, but they had created a legend that would outlive their empire by millennia. They had killed a king, but they had birthed an idea that moral courage is stronger than overwhelming force. The Greeks who survived Thermopylae carried more than news, they carried inspiration. The story of Leonidas spread like fire through the Greek world. Here was proof that Persian soldiers could bleed, that Xerxes could be defied, that David really could face Goliath if David was willing to pay the price. Marathon had shown that Greeks could defeat Persians. Thermopylae showed that Greeks would die before submitting to them. Salamis and Plataea followed, victories that might never have happened if Leonidas hadn't first shown that victory was possible. His death became the catalyst that saved Western civilization, not through what he won, but through what he was willing to lose. Not through the enemies he killed, but through the example he lived and died. But the influence of Leonidas extended far beyond military history. Centuries later, when Zeno of Citium founded the Stoic school, the echoes of Thermopylae could be heard in every principle he taught. The idea that virtue is the only true good. The belief that external circumstances can't touch your inner freedom. The understanding that how you die matters more than how long you live. Marcus Aurelius, writing his meditations centuries after Leonidas's death, could have been describing the Spartan king when he wrote about the man who faces necessity without complaint, who performs his duty without regard for praise or blame, who maintains his principles even when maintaining them costs everything. Leonidas had lived these ideas before they had names. Epictetus, teaching about what we can and cannot control, was articulating lessons that Leonidas had demonstrated in action. The Spartan king couldn't control the size of Xerxes' army or the outcome of the battle, but he could control his response to both. He couldn't guarantee victory, but he could guarantee meaning. He couldn't save his own life, but he could save his honor, and in doing so, save something much larger than himself. The modern world still needs the example of Leonidas, not because we face Persian armies, but because we face choices that test our character just as severely. The choice between what's easy and what's right, between what's profitable and what's honorable, between what's safe and what's necessary. In boardrooms and classrooms, in hospital rooms and courtrooms, people still face their own Thermopylae moments. Times when standing firm matters more than standing safely. Leonidas teaches us that heroism isn't about supernatural powers or perfect circumstances. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when everything is on the line. It's about finding the strength to do what needs to be done, even when what needs to be done is impossible. It's about understanding that some things are worth more than breathing. The living philosophy, Stoicism made flesh. Long before philosophers would debate the nature of virtue in marble halls, a warrior king was living those virtues in bronze and blood. Leonidas didn't study Stoicism. He was Stoicism, walking around in a red cloak with a spear in his hand. Every principle that would later define the school was already fully formed in his character, tested not in theoretical discussions, but in the crucible of life and death. Consider the Stoic emphasis on accepting what you cannot control while focusing entirely on what you can. Leonidas couldn't control the size of Xerxes' army, the politics of the Greek city-states, or the mountain path that would ultimately doom his position, but he could control his response to all of these realities. He chose courage over comfort, principle over pragmatism, meaning over survival, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The Stoics taught that external circumstances, wealth, health, even life itself, are indifferent. What matters is how you respond to them. Leonidas lived this truth without needing to philosophize about it. Facing overwhelming odds, he remained calm. Confronting certain death, he remained purposeful. Watching his men fall around him, he remained steadfast. He proved that peace isn't the absence of chaos, but the presence of inner stability, no matter what chaos surrounds you. Virtue ethics, the idea that character matters more than consequences, wasn't abstract theory for Leonidas. It was daily practice. He didn't measure success by whether he won or lost, but by whether he acted with courage, justice, wisdom, and self-control. The four cardinal virtues of Stoicism weren't concepts he studied. They were muscles he exercised every day until they became as natural as breathing. When Stoic philosophers would later write about memento mori, remembering death to better appreciate life, they were describing something Leonidas had mastered. He lived every day knowing it might be his last, and that knowledge didn't paralyze him with fear. It liberated him from petty concerns and focused him on what truly mattered. Death wasn't his enemy, meaninglessness was. The Stoic concept of sympatheia, the interconnectedness of all things, was lived reality for Leonidas. He understood that his actions would ripple far beyond his own life, that his choice to stand at Thermopylae would echo through history, that his death might accomplish more than his survival ever could. He saw himself not as an isolated individual, but as part of something larger, the ongoing human struggle between freedom and tyranny, courage and cowardice, meaning and emptiness. Perhaps most remarkably, Leonidas embodied the Stoic principle of premeditatio malorum, imagining loss and hardship to reduce their power over you. He didn't hope for an easy life, he prepared for a difficult one. When the worst possible scenarios actually occurred, he was ready. Not because he was naturally fearless, but because he had trained himself to find strength in acceptance rather than waste energy on denial. The greatest Stoic teachers all emphasize that philosophy means nothing if it doesn't change how you live. Leonidas never had to worry about this gap between theory and practice because his philosophy was his practice. Every day was a test of character. Every decision was an opportunity to choose virtue over vice. Every challenge was a chance to prove that principles matter more than convenience. This is why studying Leonidas is more valuable than reading 100 philosophical treatises. He shows us what Stoicism looks like when it's tested by fire. He demonstrates that these aren't just pretty ideas for comfortable people to discuss. They're practical tools for surviving and thriving in a world that will test you, challenge you, and ultimately demand that you choose who you're going to be. Modern readers often struggle with Stoic concepts because they seem abstract or impractical, but Leonidas makes them concrete. Want to understand what "the obstacle is the way" means? Look at how he turned the narrow pass at Thermopylae into an advantage. Want to grasp what it means to focus on what you can control? Watch him prepare his mind and his men while accepting the reality of their situation. Want to see what virtue under pressure looks like? Study his final 3 days. The beauty of Leonidas as a model is that he wasn't superhuman. He was a man who faced the same fundamental challenges we all face: fear, uncertainty, pressure, loss. The difference is that he had developed the mental and moral muscles to meet these challenges with grace. He had practiced virtue until it became instinct. He had chosen his principles before the crisis hit, so when the moment of truth arrived, he knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. This is the gift Leonidas gives us, proof that Stoic principles work under the most extreme conditions imaginable. If they worked for him facing impossible odds with death certain, they can work for us facing whatever challenges we encounter. We may never face Persian armies, but we all face moments that test our character, our courage, our commitment to what we claim to believe. The immortal example, leadership that transcends time. True leadership isn't measured in years ruled or battles won. It's measured in how long your example continues to inspire people you'll never meet. By this standard, Leonidas wasn't just a successful king. He was one of history's greatest leaders. More than 2 millennia after his death, his name still represents the kind of leadership the world desperately needs. Leadership that serves rather than takes, that sacrifices rather than demands sacrifice from others, that stands firm when everything else falls apart. What made Leonidas extraordinary wasn't his crown or his military skills. It was his understanding that leadership is ultimately about character under pressure. Anyone can lead when times are good, when resources are abundant, when following is easy. But real leaders reveal themselves when the easy path leads away from what's right, when doing your duty costs everything, when standing firm means standing alone. Leonidas led through example, not explanation. He didn't give lengthy speeches about courage. He showed his men what courage looked like by walking calmly towards certain death. He didn't lecture about loyalty. He demonstrated it by staying with his men when he could have escaped. He didn't philosophize about honor. He lived it so completely that his very presence reminded others what honor meant. This kind of leadership through embodiment rather than rhetoric, is desperately needed today. In a world full of leaders who say one thing and do another, who demand sacrifice while avoiding it themselves, who speak of principles but abandon them when principles become inconvenient, Leonidas stands as a reminder of what authentic leadership looks like. He shows us that real leaders don't create followers, they create other leaders. His 300 didn't fight bravely because they feared him, but because they were inspired by him. They didn't obey his orders, they rose to meet his standard. He didn't diminish them to elevate himself. He elevated them by showing them what they were capable of becoming. The influence of Leonidas extends far beyond military leadership. In boardrooms and classrooms, in hospitals and courtrooms, in families and communities, people still look to his example when they need to find the strength to do what's right instead of what's easy. Because the fundamental challenge of leadership hasn't changed, how do you maintain your principles when maintaining them costs you something precious? Modern leadership development focuses heavily on techniques and strategies, but Leonidas reminds us that leadership is fundamentally about character. It's about becoming the kind of person others trust to make hard decisions, to tell difficult truths, to stand firm when everything shakes. These qualities can't be faked or learned from a manual. They have to be forged through experience, tested through trial, and proven through consistency. Perhaps most importantly, Leonidas demonstrates that true leadership often requires redefining success. He didn't succeed by the conventional metrics of his time. He lost his battle, lost his men, lost his life. But he succeeded by a deeper measure. He accomplished his mission. He inspired resistance. He proved that even overwhelming power can be challenged. He showed that there are things worth dying for, which means there are things worth living for. This understanding of success measured by meaning rather than just outcomes, is crucial for leaders in any era. Because there will always be moments when doing the right thing doesn't lead to immediate rewards, when taking the principled stand costs you opportunities, when being true to your values puts you at a disadvantage. In those moments, the example of Leonidas reminds us that some victories can only be won through apparent defeat. The modern world faces challenges that would have been unimaginable in Leonidas's time, but the fundamental need for principled leadership remains constant. Climate change, technological disruption, social inequality, political polarization, these problems don't have easy solutions, and addressing them requires leaders willing to take unpopular positions, make difficult decisions, and sometimes sacrifice their own interests for the greater good. Leonidas won't give us specific answers to these modern challenges, but he gives us something more valuable, an example of how to face impossible challenges with integrity intact. He shows us that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having unshakable principles when the questions become overwhelming. The call that echoes. Still, your personal Thermopylae. Every person alive will face their own Thermopylae, a moment when everything you claim to believe is put to the ultimate test. It might not involve Persian armies or mountain passes, but it will require the same fundamental choice Leonidas faced. Do you stand for what you believe is right, even when standing costs you everything? Your Thermopylae might be a boardroom where you're asked to compromise your ethics for profit. It might be a social situation where speaking up for someone who's being mistreated would cost you your popularity. It might be a personal crisis where taking the easy way out would solve your immediate problems, but destroy your long-term integrity. It might be a moment when helping someone else would put your own security at risk. The beauty of Leonidas's example is that it scales. You don't need to be facing world historical choices to benefit from his wisdom. The same principles that guided him at Thermopylae can guide you through the much smaller but equally important choices you face every day. The decision to keep your word, even when breaking it, would be convenient. The choice to tell the truth, even when lying, would be easier. The commitment to excellence, even when mediocrity would be acceptable. What Leonidas teaches us is that character isn't built in moments of crisis. It's built in moments of choice. Every day, in small ways, we're either strengthening our principles or weakening them. We're either practicing virtue or practicing vice. We're either preparing ourselves to stand firm when it matters, or we're training ourselves to bend when the pressure comes. The daily disciplines that prepared Leonidas for his final test weren't dramatic. Getting up early, training consistently, keeping his word, doing his duty without complaint, putting the needs of his people before his own comfort, maintaining his standards even when no one was watching. These habits, repeated day after day, year after year, created the character that could face impossible odds without flinching. This is the most practical lesson Leonidas offers. Heroism isn't about perfect moments, it's about consistent choices. You don't need to wait for a crisis to start living with courage. You can start right now, with whatever challenge you're facing, however small it might seem. Because every time you choose principle over convenience, every time you do what's right instead of what's easy, you're building the kind of character that can stand firm when everything else falls apart. The question isn't whether you'll face difficult choices. You will. The question is whether you'll be ready for them. Whether you'll have developed the mental and moral muscles necessary to do what needs to be done, even when what needs to be done is hard. Whether you'll be able to look back on your life and know that you stood for something meaningful, even if it cost you something precious. Leonidas didn't become a legend because he was born special. He became a legend because he chose, day after day, to become the kind of person who could rise to meet an extraordinary moment. He practiced virtue until it became instinct. He disciplined his mind until fear couldn't paralyze him. He clarified his values until no temptation could corrupt them. The same opportunity exists for you, not to become king of Sparta or to face Persian armies, but to become the kind of person who lives with purpose, leads by example, and leaves the world a little better than you found it. To develop the character that can weather any storm, the principles that can guide you through any confusion, the courage that can carry you through any challenge, your Thermopylae is coming. It might be next week, next year, or next decade, but it's coming. The question is, will you be ready? Will you have built the kind of character that can stand firm? Will you have clarified the kind of values that are worth defending? Will you have developed the kind of courage that doesn't roar but simply stands still when everything else runs away? The legacy of Leonidas isn't just a story from the past. It's a challenge for the present, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they've prepared themselves through ordinary disciplines. That heroes aren't born, they're forged through daily choices to become better than they were yesterday. The hot gates await, not in ancient Greece, but in your own life. The only question is, when your moment comes, will you be ready to answer the call? Conclusion: the eternal warrior. Leonidas died at Thermopylae, but he achieved something rarer than victory. He achieved immortality through meaning. His story endures not because he won, but because of how he lost. Not because his life was easy, but because of how he handled difficulty. Not because he avoided death, but because of how he embraced it, when embracing it served something greater than survival. In a world that often measures success by accumulation of wealth, power, status, years, Leonidas reminds us that true success is measured by contribution. What did you give? What did you stand for? When the moment came that defined who you really were, did you rise to meet it, or did you shrink away? The Persian Empire that killed Leonidas crumbled into dust centuries ago. The political systems of his time are ancient history. The military tactics he used are obsolete. But the principles he embodied, courage, integrity, sacrifice for something greater than yourself, these remain as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. Because these principles aren't about specific circumstances, they're about what it means to be human at your highest potential. Leonidas shows us that philosophy isn't just for philosophers, that heroism isn't just for heroes, that leadership isn't just for leaders. These qualities are available to anyone willing to pay the price in daily discipline, consistent character building, and the courage to stand firm when standing firm is hard. You may never face Persian armies, but you'll face challenges that test your character just as severely. You may never wear a crown, but you'll have opportunities to lead by example. You may never hold a spear at Thermopylae, but you'll have chances to take a stand for what you believe in. The question isn't whether these moments will come, they will. The question is whether you'll be ready for them, whether you'll have built the kind of character that can rise to meet extraordinary circumstances, whether you'll have clarified the kind of principles that are worth defending, even when defending them costs you something precious. Leonidas didn't become immortal because he lived forever. He became immortal because he lived with purpose. He didn't achieve greatness because everything went his way. He achieved greatness because of how he responded when everything went wrong. This is his gift to you, proof that it's possible, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that character matters more than circumstances, that how you face the inevitable difficulties of life matters more than whether you can avoid them. The warrior king of Sparta spoke very few words that history recorded, but his life speaks volumes. It says that courage is possible, that integrity is achievable, that meaning matters more than comfort, that there are things worth standing for, even when standing costs everything. 2 millennia later, his message echoes still: stand firm, live with purpose, lead by example, face the impossible with calm determination. And when your final moment comes, make sure it's a moment that matters. The hot gates are closed now, but the choice they represent remains open. Every day, in small ways and large, you face the same fundamental decision Leonidas faced. Will you choose comfort or courage? Will you choose what's easy or what's right? Will you choose to survive or to truly live? The legacy of Leonidas isn't just about the past, it's about the future. Your future, the person you're becoming through the choices you make every day. The character you're building through the disciplines you practice or neglect. The hero you might become if you're willing to pay the price in daily virtue that heroism demands. The Persian armies are gone, but the need for courage remains. The ancient world has passed away, but the call to greatness echoes still. Leonidas fought his battle and won his victory through defeat. Now it's your turn. What will your Thermopylae be? And when it comes, will you be ready?